Okay, I'd just like to welcome to today's talk and uncovering the stories of Chinese Australian families with Dr. Kate Bagnall from University of Tasmania. Today's talk is being broadcast as a webinar, and I think we've got about 31 people registered, 25 registered for Clifford, and we're pleased to welcome those people who are going to join us online today. In due course, the talk will be available on Libraries Tasmania's SoundCloud and on Libraries Tasmania's YouTube channel. And Clifford has already uploaded last week's Tuesday's talk. So the first talk is already there. If you haven't already done so, can you please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent? Kate, you'd like to take if people have questions at the end of your talk. Before I introduce Kate, I'd just like to read to you the Libraries Tasmania's acknowledgement of Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples. Libraries Tasmania recognises the deep histories and cultures of the Aboriginal people of Lituita, Tasmania. We acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of the land, waters and sky. We pay respect to the elders past and present who hold the memories, traditions, culture and knowledge of country. We extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose countries were never ceded. Kate is a social historian whose research explores histories of migration, citizenship, family and law. And one of her particular interests is the women and children and families of Australia's early Chinese communities. Kate is Senior Lecturer in Humanities and Coordinator of the Family History Program at the University of Tasmania. Please join me in welcoming Kate.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Sandra. So it's a real pleasure to be here at Libraries Tasmania in Nipaluna, Hobart, speaking to you today. And so hello to you all here and those of you who are on the webinar as well. So I would also like to acknowledge the Mawinana people, the traditional owners and custodians of the unceded land on which we are meeting today. And I pay my respects to your elders past and present. All right, let's get started. Over the past couple of decades, a number of Australian and New Zealand writers have produced works of historical fiction featuring romances between white women and Chinese men. One of the best known is the ongoing and somewhat illicit liaison between Kerry Greenwood's lady detective, Phryne Fisher, and Lin Chung, the Cambridge-educated son of an elite Victorian Chinese family of silk merchants, whose progenitor had first arrived in Australia with the gold rushes. Lin Chung first appears in the 7th book of the Phryne Fisher series, Ruddy Gore, which was published in 1995. And while he's an intermittent character across the 24 novels, he, along with a string of other lovers, is central to the portrayal of Phryne's liberal attitude towards life and obvious pleasure in flaunting the social mores of respectable 1920s Melbourne. A few other examples are worth mentioning as well. There's Nerida Newton's The Lambing Flat, published in 2003, which won the Queensland Premier's Literary Award for an Emerging Author in 2002. It follows the intertwined lives of Ella, born and bred on a Queensland cattle station, and Locke, who arrives in Australia as a boy and experiences the violence of the Lambing Flat anti-Chinese riots of 1861, before heading north to Queensland. He finds work on Ella's father's property, and the love story progresses from there. There's also As the Earth Turns Silver by New Zealand author Alison Wong, which won the Janet Frame Fiction Award in 2009. Set against the backdrop of racist white working class Wellington, New Zealand, in the early 20th century, the book tells the ultimately tragic story of a secret love affair between widow and mother of two, Catherine McKechnie, and Wong Chung-young, a greengrocer. Then there's Deborah O'Brien's Mr. Chen's Emporium and its sequel, The Jade Widow, which are aimed more at the book club market. Mr. Chen's Emporium plots a fairly predictable romantic path to the marriage of Amy Duncan and Charles Chen in a small New South Wales goldfield town in the 1870s. And their relationship, once again, ends tragically. While not great literature, Mr. Chen's Emporium is nonetheless pretty spot on with its history. So as a historian, I've spent much of my career looking into the lives of white women and Chinese men who formed intimate relationships in the past, women and men like the protagonists in these novels. This research is part of my broader interest in the histories of women, children and families in Australasia's early Chinese communities. And just a note here, the Chinese Australian families that I'm going to be talking about today are mostly those made up of a white mother and Chinese father. So it interests me very much to see the stories of Chinese European couples being told again through fiction in the 21st century, in television as well as in the novels I've mentioned. Some of you might have watched, for example, the 2021 SBS miniseries New Gold Mountain, which touches on the tangled lives of Chinese men and white women on the Victorian goldfields. So I say that these stories are being told again because more than a century ago, in the 1880s and 1890s, intimate relationships between white women and Chinese men were not an uncommon subject in popular Australian fiction. Typified by Edward Dyson's Mr. and Mrs. Sin Fat, published in the Bulletin in 1888, or William Lane's novella, White or Yellow, The Race War of 1908 AD, which was published as a serial in the Boomerang in 1887, these late 19th century stories tell a very different tale of interracial relationships from those in the 21st century. They tell of their dangers on a personal and societal level. Such stories both drew on and fed accounts that appeared in popular newspapers, such as the notoriously salacious Truth. I want to suggest, however, that the telling of these two very different narratives of love and sex across racial boundaries have something very much in common. And that is that their meaning, their power as stories, comes from their acknowledgement of not just the possibility, but the reality of intimate relationships between white women and Chinese men in Australia and New Zealand in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the scare power of stories like those published in the Bulletin and the Boomerang came from an understanding that all around the Australasian colonies, white women and Chinese men were getting together. Yes, in opium dens and brothels, but also through contacts at church, at the store, across the threshold of the home, in the neighbourhood. These stories presented a threatening future of racial mixing in Australia that was made more real by the presence of real mixed-race couples and their mixed-race children in colonial communities. They were simply there. Estimates calculated by historians like myself put the number of legal marriages between Chinese men and white women in the Australasian colonies in the 19th century in their thousands. But of course, there were many other relationships that were not formalised through marriage, and many children were born out of wedlock. So while official statistics are unreliable in giving the true number of children born to white mothers and Chinese fathers, they do give some indication of their significance in the Chinese Australian population overall. Here, for example, is a breakdown of the birthplaces of Chinese people in New South Wales in 1901, where you can see in blue that a total of 1,223 were Australian born, so born in New South Wales and in other Australian states. And of them, just over 1,000, or about 9% of the total Chinese population, were so-called half-castes, which in this case meant people of mixed white and Chinese heritage. But what about Tasmania, I hear you say? Looking at 1901 again, there in the third column, the Chinese population of Tasmania at that time was 609, according to the census, of whom 103, or about 17%, of the population were of mixed Chinese and European parentage. So over the course of the 20th century, though, the obvious presence of Chinese European couples and their families faded for various reasons, within families themselves, in popular memory, and in historical accounts. The perception that lingered was that interracial relationships between white women and Chinese men were bound up with prostitution, alcoholism, opium addiction, and so on, and that only, quote, a few illiterate Irish girls were desperate enough to marry themselves to Chinese men. What was forgotten were that thousands of Chinese European couples, what was forgotten was that there were thousands of Chinese European couples who mostly unremarkably met, formed relationships of various kinds for shorter or longer periods, had children and raised them together or apart. So families like that of Hannah Maria Mason, who was born in Launceston in 1844, and her Amoy-born husband, William Edward Oram Chi. And you can see them here. Hannah and William were married in the Wesleyan parsonage at Newtown, Sydney, in 1865, 4 years after William was baptised as a Christian. After the stillbirth of their first child in 1866, Hannah and William went on to have another son, who it's believed is in this picture, and 5 daughters. William was naturalised as a British subject in 1868, and the family became part of the community in Scone, in central New South Wales, where they made their home. It has really only been in this new century, over the past 25 years or so, that early Chinese European families like the Chis have been remembered and recognised on a broader scale. The historical novels that I've mentioned are one manifestation of this. Alongside the work of academic historians like myself, it's largely been the growing interest in family history that has shifted our understanding as family researchers have pieced together often hidden parts of their own family histories. These same family historians, as well as local and community historians, are increasingly visible online, creating their own blogs and websites, making family trees in Ancestry.com, and participating in family history forums and Facebook groups. They're publishing memoirs and family histories, they're presenting at history conferences, and they're collaborating with researchers in universities and GLAM organisations, particularly museums. If you're an avid viewer, you might also have noticed stories of Chinese European families pop up in the popular television series, Who Do You Think You Are? I appeared in both of these episodes. So in 2018, there was the story of actor John Jarrett's 2 times great-grandparents, Martha Hamilton and Yacht, who lived at a little place called Gemmaconbean on the Braidwood goldfields in New South Wales. And more recently, in 2021, there was the story of musician and original Purple Wiggle, Jeff Fatt's 2 times great-grandparents, Elizabeth Wright and Lee Young, who lived at Ararat and Ballarat on the Victorian goldfields. So when I first began researching Chinese European couples back in the late 1990s, a common question I was asked about my work was why? In particular, why did these white women choose Chinese partners? The implication being, I think, a slightly different question, and that was, wasn't there anyone else for them to marry? The decisions made by mixed-race couples in the choice of partner can seem extraordinary for their time, but they may, in fact, have been very simple ones to make, based around love, sexual attraction, the desire for companionship, or due to circumstance, convenience, or economics. Despite some failings in historical accuracy, one of the things that I like most about seeing Chinese European relationships portrayed in contemporary fiction is the way that fiction can present historical possibilities that, it seems, are still often hard for many of us to imagine. Once you start looking for it, though, evidence of Chinese European couples and families is abundant. And particularly with the digitisation of more and more historical materials, that evidence is increasingly easy to find and access. The historical newspapers available through Trove from the National Library, are a particularly rich source for Chinese Australian family history, and one that I wish I had when I started my own research. So here, for instance, is a graph of references to the term, quote, half-caste Chinese in the digitised newspapers in Trove for the period from 1860 to 1920. The blue line is all Australian newspapers, and the little orange line at the bottom is Tasmanian newspapers. So this graph was created using a nifty app called QueryPick, which was created by digital historian Tim Sherratt. So the articles that come up through this searching trove range from invectives in major city newspapers about opium and smallpox and the Chinese question, to reports in small country newspapers on all manner of moments in the everyday lives of Chinese Australian families and individuals. So as a historian who's kind of looking both at the big picture and the small detail, I'm very lucky that race was mentioned in articles such as these, as it marks these articles as of immediate interest to me. But of course, personal names can also be traced through time in the newspapers in a way that was near impossible before. Trove and its New Zealand counterpart Papers Past give us the ability to easily uncover small stories of ordinary lives, and this helps break through a barrier in thinking about the prevalence and place of Chinese European couples and families in colonial Australasia. So our understanding of the history of Chinese Australian families has come a long way in the past 25 years. When I started my research in 1998, the available historical literature said that little that was of help to me about Chinese Australian family life, particularly in understanding these families within the context of Chinese migration. Most histories overlooked the presence of migrant Chinese women and their daughters in colonial and post-Federation Australasia. And those few that discussed Chinese European families in any detail framed their lives as stories of pioneers or of assimilation. Unusual exceptions to the dominant story of the sojourning gold seeker living a lonely life, working to make his fortune and return home to China. Many Chinese Australian family histories are easily slotted into these sorts of narratives, and it can make sense to tell them this way, particularly for descendants, community activists, and historians of many kinds who are still struggling to assert Chinese people into a national story that remains one predominantly about white people. They are keen to stress how people of Chinese heritage, whether migrant or Australian born, have contributed to the building of this nation, particularly through agriculture, mining, and business. However, when I started to look closely into the lives of Chinese European couples and their children, the pioneer or assimilationist frameworks did not fit so well with the evidence I found about the mixing of language and cultural traditions within the home, and about the ongoing connections that mixed families fostered and maintained with local Chinese communities and with China itself. For example, the Australian-born mixed-race daughters of Chinese settlers commonly married migrant Chinese men, sometimes men as old as their own fathers, creating networks of kinship ties and often drawing young Australian-born women towards their Chinese rather than European heritage. This picture, for example, shows Emma Lee Young with her husband, the Reverend Joseph Tia Tak, and 4 of their children, Elizabeth, Joseph, Laura, and Josiah, who were born between 1886 and 1892. As featured in Who Do You Think You Are?, Emma was Purple Wiggle Jeff Fat's great-grandmother. She was born in Ararat, Victoria in 1865, and at the age of 20, married China-born Joseph Tia Tak, who was about 17 years her senior. With Joseph's church work, he was a missionary, the family moved from Ararat in Victoria to the Inverell district in New South Wales, where we think this photo was taken, and then on to Darwin and eventually Cairns. Numbers of Chinese European children were also taken or sent to China, to help them become Chinese by receiving a Chinese education and or by being raised within their father's extended families. White wives too went to China, where some encountered for the first time the unhappy reality that they were not their husband's only wife. For according to Chinese custom, men were able to take multiple wives and concubines. Other white wives said goodbye to children and husbands who left for China and never returned. Such practices as these didn't fit neatly with the idea that Chinese men who formed relationships with white women who fathered mixed-race children were simply assimilating, turning their backs on their own ancestry and heritage and abandoning an identity as Chinese for themselves and their children, even when it might have seemed on the surface that that's what they were doing. Quang Tat, who you see here in the middle in that lovely check suit, he was a well-known Sydney tea merchant and shown here with his wife, Margaret, and their 3 oldest children in Hong Kong in 1894. And he's an interesting example to look at. We know Quang Tat best as the dapper businessman and philanthropist, anti-opium campaigner, and a friend to Sydney's elite, and coincidentally, a friend of my great-grandfather. He was also the beloved husband of Lancashire-born Margaret, née Scarlett, and father to a brood of handsome children who were educated at some of Sydney's finest private schools. Yet Quang Tat's business interests were reliant on ongoing contacts with Hong Kong and China, and it seems that he remained close to his family, returning to China 3 times, including on this trip in 1894 to introduce his young family to his elderly mother. Research by Chinese historian Mei Wei-Chiang and information gathered within the family also suggests, however, that Quang Tat was also married by proxy in absentia to a Chinese woman, and that 1, perhaps 2 sons were adopted to carry on his name in his hometown in Toishan. So how to reconcile this in a man who was known as Australia's kind of ultimate assimilated Chinese? So an article by US historian Adam McEwen, which was published in 1999, on transnational Chinese families and Chinese exclusion, suggested to me that there was an alternative way of viewing these relationships, an alternative explanation for why Chinese men outmarried, that is, partnered with non-Chinese women, and a real way of understanding these families within the context of Chinese migration. McEwen was among a number of scholars who've outlined the family strategies used by Cantonese in the Sending districts in the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong in southern China, from where most 19th century Chinese migration took place. And this map shows the 13 counties of the Pearl River Delta, which is just inland from Hong Kong. And so pretty much all of the Chinese who came to 19th century Australasia came from this tiny part of southern China. So central to the Cantonese family was the patriline, the ongoing line of descent from father to son, father to son. Cantonese families in the Sending districts of the Pearl River Delta undertook economic strategies to ensure their survival and prosperity. For example, they established sons in different occupations, or they sent them to different overseas locations, such as Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. They also developed strategies to ensure the continuation of the family line when more usual patterns of family formation were not possible due to the often long absences of men overseas. Most common was the so-called split family, where a man lived overseas for shorter or longer periods, while his wife remained at home in the ancestral village, living with her in-laws or other members of her husband's family. So when a man had left unmarried and was not easily able to return, he could be married by proxy in absentia to a woman who then took up residence in her parents-in-law home. Sons could be adopted to ensure the patriline continued, even if husband and wife never met due to his continued residence overseas. So non-Chinese women were drawn into this when they formed relationships with Chinese men. And it was not uncommon for Chinese men, as I've said, to already have a wife and sometimes children at home in China when they formed relationships overseas. Chinese families could be opposed to men taking foreign wives out of fear that his interests and energies would be redirected away from the ancestral home and his filial obligations there. But children born to non-Chinese women in places like Australia and New Zealand, Hawaii, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Jamaica, and Peru. We have examples of children returning to China from all of these places. They still counted as Chinese and as part of their Chinese families. Their paternity, not their maternity, mattered. And the evidence for this is in the number of children of mixed race who went to China for a period of education or more permanently. And this was a practice that was happening in the Australasian colonies from as early as the late 1850s. So the National Archives of Australia holds thousands of documents that trace the journeys of young Australians of Chinese and part Chinese descent to China and back over the early years of the 20th century, after the introduction of the Federal Immigration Restriction Act in 1901. So included among those who went to China were a small number of children of mixed Chinese and Aboriginal descent, as well as a few white stepchildren of Chinese men. You might, for instance, have heard of Tasmanian Senator Thomas Backup, who was the son of Margaret Hogan and stepson of G. Backup of Lotta in northeastern Tasmania. There is some debate about whether Thomas Backup had Chinese heritage or not, but he became fluent in Cantonese and, according to historian Adrian Petty, had spent several years in China, some as a young child and then later in his early teens. So, before I conclude, I'd like to share one more family story, that of the Gan family, pictured here in Melbourne in 1917. There is Edward Chung Gan, usually known as Teddy Gan, who was naturalised as a British subject in Tasmania in 1891. His Victorian-born wife Annie, née Harris, and their 4 children, Dorothy, George, Ruby Elizabeth, and Frederick. The family left Australia for Hong Kong in 1917, where Teddy found work at the Hong Kong and Whampoa Dock Company, and Annie was busy with her growing family. She gave birth to 3 more children in Hong Kong. So they'd left in 1917. And then in 1925 and again in 1933, the family attempted to return to Australia, but this request was denied by the government due to Teddy's extended absence from the Commonwealth. And there is nothing on file to indicate that they ever returned home. So placing the history of Chinese European families within a transnational framework, like that suggested by McEwen's Transnational Overseas Chinese Family, allows us to see the parts of the story that took place beyond Australian shores. Chinese migration to Australia wasn't a simple one-way trip. Economic, cultural, and legal factors meant that Australian Chinese were highly mobile, travelling back and forth between Australia and China and between the colonies or states. The formation of families followed a similar path, and limiting our definition of family life to the geographically localised nuclear family ignores a range of experiences and choices made in the process of migration, sojourning, and settlement. So, to conclude, let's go back to those historical novels, where we can also see aspects of the transnational overseas Chinese family. Lady Detective Phryne Fisher sees her lover Lin Chung married to a young Chinese woman, Camellia, in an arranged marriage that benefits both of their Chinese families, if not themselves. In The Earth Turns Silver, Catherine McKechnie's Chinese lover has a wife and child in China, while his brother works for years to be able to bring his wife to live in New Zealand too. In The Lambing Flat, Ella has to confront Locke's yearning for his homeland and his ultimate decision to return home. He asks her to go too. And some of my favourite passages in the book describe Ella's feelings as she contemplates whether she could leave her home and go with him. In the end, though, she doesn't. What these imagined life stories suggest, and other real-life histories demonstrate, is that there is not just one neat framework into which we can place the history of Chinese European families in Australasia, and beyond that, the history of Chinese Australian families more generally. This history is messy and complex and sometimes hard to untangle. But for me, it's this messiness and complexity that also makes it so fascinating. Thank you.
Got any questions from people online? People want to ask?
None so far.
None so far. Is there any questions from the audience I'd like to? Oh, Lydia at the back.
You were saying that there's lots of Chinese men who married white women. Were there white men who married Chinese women?
That's a really great question. So the question was, I've talked a lot about Chinese men who married white women, but were there white men who married Chinese women? That's the right way around. If I go back to my statistics, where are we? Tasmania one's probably the easiest one. So if you look on that line there that says full Chinese, so most of those Chinese who were counted as full Chinese would have been migrant Chinese. So you can see that comparatively there were very, very small numbers of Chinese women who migrated to Australia. Certainly, so in that kind of first migrant generation, the majority of Chinese women who are coming as wives of men who've already settled here, or as daughters, or as domestic servants, as moijai. But in that second generation of Australian-born daughters, whether they were full Chinese or of mixed parentage, there is marriage the other way. Yeah, so it kind of depends on the generation.
What about the legal implications of the white women? Like,
That's what I was thinking. That was my question.
Baptised or Australian citizens before they got married, or was it like a path to citizenship for them?
That's a really good question. It's one that's very dependent on at what point in time. So up until the 20th century, kind of ideas around citizenship don't matter quite so much for women. Because it's less codified. In the British Empire, kind of if you're born in the empire, you're a British subject. If you're born in China, obviously you're a Qing subject. But those women, those white wives, for example, who were going to China, they did seek protection from the British consuls. There are cases where they kind of get stuck, and so they seek the help of the British consuls. But their children, once they've left Australia, are considered Chinese by the Chinese sort of legal system. So that's where those tricky parts come in. But certainly within colonial Australia, there was no legal impediment to Chinese men marrying white women. We didn't have anti-miscegenation legislation like in the United States. So particularly California was known to have laws that prevented marriages between Chinese men and white women. So that didn't happen in Australia. So, I mean, there are instances of men who were baptised shortly before they are married, and whether that's because their wife said, you know, you have to be baptised before I'm going to marry you, or whether it was a requirement by the minister who was marrying them. Yeah.
I also was thinking on the same lines of the bigamy where Chinese men are allowed to have, but in Australian laws, we're only allowed to have one wife. So how did they?
Well, I think
those laws?
I think bigamy happened a lot more often than we think it did. You know, it's actually very easy to change your identity. You know, you change colony, you change name, you can make up any details. You know, nobody was carrying around a passport or an identity document that said who they were. So no one was checking that. There was no way to check, in fact, that someone wasn't married already. So, yeah.
And were the I suppose the Australian white women, were they frowned upon when they went to China? Do they sort of have anything? Do sort of historians sort of?
Yeah. So Sandra's question is: were white women frowned upon when they went to live in China? So. This is one of my favourite topics. I could talk about this for a long time, Sandra. Because I've done a lot of research about the experiences of these white women who went back to Hong Kong and Guangdong, and they did experience quite difficult conditions, in part because they were confronting a family system that was unfamiliar to them. You know, entering into that household, they weren't the boss anymore. They had to do what the family wanted them to do and what their children wanted to do. And if there was a first wife there already, it was expected that those Australian children that came back would be under her kind of control and instruction. So it left white wives with less power within the family dynamic. So those instances I talked about where white women had sought help from the British consul or authorities was where they were wanting to leave China with their children, but the father's family were not wanting them to remove the children from China again. So, I mean, I think there was kind of religious, climate, food, all of those culture shock things that I think any of us face when we go somewhere different. Yeah.
I was just wondering, kind of along similar lines, but is there any evidence that women that married Chinese men face prejudice in art both in Australia?
So the question was, did white women who married Chinese face prejudice in Australia? And absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, there was kind of a reputational damage, I guess, that, there was this assumption, as I said, that a white woman who consorted with a Chinese man was immoral. Often they were seen as being kind of, debauched prostitutes, those kind of stereotypes. And those stereotypes came with the racial mixing, whoever the woman was. We know examples of women whose families kind of disowned them when they formed a partnership with a Chinese man. But we also know of examples where, the Chinese husbands were welcomed and, were wonderful, kind, caring husbands. So, you can't generalise, but certainly the ways that the press and the popular literature conceived those relationships was very much that the women had done something really bad by crossing those racial boundaries. Yeah. Oh.
Okay, that was really wonderful. I enjoyed it very much. Just to make one point, some people did get baptised so that they could be buried. So if you go out to Cornelian Bay, the division is Protestant, Methodist, Jewish, Quaker, and I know people wanted to be baptised so that they could, because once you were buried, you were allowed to have a burial stone. Otherwise, you got buried in the paupers area, which you weren't allowed to have anything. So it's that point. My question, Kate, is it's a really good coverage of white and Chinese marriages. What about any of our Indigenous people? And I know in Tasmania that's harder.
So I don't know of any examples in Tasmania, but certainly, particularly across Northern Australia, there's substantial kind of intermarriage between particularly Indigenous women and Chinese men. So in Queensland, I said that there were no anti-miscegenation laws about Chinese men and white women, but in Queensland there were laws about Chinese men and Indigenous women being able to marry because, in those systems of control of Indigenous people's lives, marriage was one of those things that was controlled by the state. So that aside, there were substantial kind of intermarriage across all of the north of Australia, and less so kind of in southern Australia, although we know of some parts of sort of northwestern New South Wales, there was a lot of mixing between Chinese and Indigenous people. And in part that is because by the time Chinese kind of migrants came from the 1850s onwards, you know, a lot of Indigenous people in southern Australia had already been dispossessed of their land or put on missions. So there was that kind of less opportunity for that mixing to take place. Yeah. Just shout, I think.
Purely selfish point of view, because I'm Chinese but without a goldfield background. I was wondering if your research is going to go on to migration post-World War II.
As a historian, I kind of stick to pre-World War II. That's just my favourite part of history, is kind of the late 19th, early 20th century. So it's a field that's wide open to further research. So yeah, but it's true. I mean, most of our understanding of Chinese Australian history is kind of focused on that 19th century or the early white Australia period. So from the post-war up until, you know, the turn of the new millennium, yeah, we need more people kind of looking at that kind of post-war era. Yeah.
Kate, you mentioned the White Australia policy, and I know that there was even the Chinese immigrants who were brought over to work the mines and whatnot were not meant to reside here permanently. They were, you know, the idea was they get sent back after their usefulness was over. How did that affect some of these liaisons?
So many of the Chinese who came to colonial Australasia were sojourners, that they themselves had the idea that they would come, work for a while and return. And that was kind of part of this cyclical pattern of mobility, of coming and going, often across generations as well. But by the time of when the White Australia policy kind of was formalised with the Immigration Restriction Act in 1901, there was already a settled community of Chinese who were in Australia. So most of those men who were here, and the smaller numbers of women, they were granted what was called domicile. So they were allowed to remain because they had established lives in Australia. What the Immigration Restriction Act did was it prevented new migration from China. So nobody was deported as such, but there could be difficulties like with Teddy Argan. If you went out of the country, you were not guaranteed to be able to return. But there are earlier and different patterns kind of around Australia. So William Chi, who we met, just saw that picture of Hannah Mason and William Chi early on. He was from Amoy, which was in a different part of China, and he was one of the very few Chinese who came as an indentured worker in the middle of the 19th century. So for about 5 or 6 years, there were men who were brought from Amoy as indentured workers, so often farm labourers, shepherds. So those men were on a contract, but there was no provision for them to go home at the end of their contract. So they, in fact, all pretty much stayed. So a lot of families in Queensland can trace, and in northern New South Wales can trace their heritage to those early Amoy shepherds. I don't know if any of you saw the Adam Liao program last week. I've now forgotten what's called. But who the bloody hell are we? There you go. Thanks, Ingor. You know, it starts with the story of one of those Amoy shepherd families, and in fact tells of a relationship with an Indigenous woman.
Oh, well,
Oh,
we might have one here.